The moment Hauptmann Werner Mulders understood the air war was lost, he was not in a cockpit. He was standing in a hangar at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's primary testing facility north of Berlin, staring at an enemy aircraft that should not have been possible. It was February 19th, 1944, and the morning light filtered through the hangar's high windows, casting long shadows across the aluminum skin of a captured American fighter, a North American P-51 Mustang. Mulders had been a technical evaluation officer with the Luftwaffe since 1939, before the war had even begun. He was not related to the famous ace Werner Mulders, though he had explained that fact countless times to officers who assumed a connection. His expertise lay not in aerial combat, but in the mathematics of flight performance calculations, range assessments, structural engineering. Before the war, he had designed aircraft components for Messerschmitt. He understood what made an aircraft effective, and more importantly, he understood what made an aircraft strategically decisive. The Mustang before him, designated Versuchsflugzeug T9 by Luftwaffe Intelligence Test Aircraft No. 9, had been forced down near Aachen in late December. Its pilot had been killed on impact, but the aircraft itself had survived relatively intact enough to be recovered, transported to Rechlin, and subjected to the kind of comprehensive technical evaluation that Mulders specialized in. For 6 weeks, he and his team had examined every aspect of this machine. They had measured, weighed, photographed, and documented. They had stripped down the Packard-built Merlin engine, marveling at its precision manufacturing. They had studied the laminar flow wing design, recognizing the aerodynamic principles that German engineers had theorized but never successfully implemented in mass production. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But what truly distinguished this aircraft from anything Germany possessed was not visible from the outside. It was something Mulders had calculated 3 times, convinced he had made an error, before finally accepting the impossible figure: range. The P-51 Mustang, with its internal fuel capacity of 269 gallons plus 2 external drop tanks, could fly over 1,650 miles on a single tank of fuel. 1,650 miles. That number represented something far more significant than mere distance. It represented the complete obsolescence of Germany's defensive strategy. Mulders stood now with a clipboard in his hands, staring at his own calculations. The mathematics were undeniable. A Mustang taking off from an airfield in southern England could escort American heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and return home with fuel to spare. It could reach Munich, Regensburg, even Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. Every target in Germany, from the Ruhr industrial valley to the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, was now within range of American escort fighters that could match or exceed the performance of Germany's frontline interceptors. This contradicted everything Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had told the Luftwaffe about American aviation. For 3 years, German fighter tactics had been built on a fundamental assumption that American escort fighters were short-ranged interceptors, capable of defending their own territory but unable to accompany bombers deep into the Reich. The strategy had been simple and, until recently, effective. Allow the American bombers to penetrate German airspace. Allow them to outrun their escorts somewhere over Belgium or northeastern France. Then position German fighters to intercept the unescorted bomber formations, choosing attack angles and timing with tactical precision. Throughout 1943, this approach had worked devastatingly well. Luftwaffe pilots had inflicted catastrophic losses on unescorted American daylight raids. On October 14th of that year, a date the Americans would call Black Thursday, a force of 291 B-17 bombers had attempted to strike the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. Without fighter escort for most of the mission, the bombers had been savaged by German interceptors. 60 B-17s were shot down outright. Another 17 were so badly damaged they never flew again. 5 more crashed attempting to return to England. The effective loss rate was nearly 30% in a single mission. After Black Thursday, the American 8th Air Force had temporarily suspended deep penetration raids into Germany. German military leadership had declared the American daylight bombing strategy a failure, proof that strategic bombing without fighter escort was unsustainable. The Luftwaffe had won a strategic victory through tactical excellence and the simple mathematics of fuel consumption. American escorts ran out of range. German defenders operated from their own airfields with full fuel and ammunition loads. And now, 3 months later, Mulders was looking at an aircraft that made every one of those assumptions obsolete. He walked around the Mustang slowly, as if proximity might reveal some flaw in his analysis. Someone had already painted Luftwaffe markings over the American stars, black crosses and swastikas that looked wrong on such a capable enemy machine. The panel gaps were tight, the riveting was precise. Every visible component spoke of quality mass production, the kind of manufacturing precision that Germany had possessed in peacetime but could no longer maintain with bombed factories, material shortages, and increasingly desperate substitution of strategic metals. The door to the hangar opened, admitting a blast of February cold, and Oberleutnant Klaus Brenner, Mulders's colleague and fellow evaluation officer. Brenner had taught aviation mathematics at the Technical Academy in Munich before the war. If anyone could identify an error in Mulders's range calculations, it would be him. "Have you verified the fuel consumption figures?" Mulders asked without preamble. Brenner pulled out his own notebook, flipping to a page covered in calculations. "I have. Multiple power settings, various altitudes, accounting for climb, cruise, and combat reserves. The aircraft's fuel efficiency is extraordinary. At optimal cruise, approximately 300 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, the Packard Merlin consumes roughly 65 gallons per hour. With 435 gallons total capacity, including drop tanks, that gives a maximum endurance of approximately 6.5 hours. At cruise speed, that translates to 1,650 miles. Mulders finished. "I got the same number." Brenner closed his notebook. So did Hauptmann Richter in propulsion analysis. 3 independent calculations, 3 identical results. "Werner, this aircraft can escort bombers anywhere in Germany." The implications crystallized with terrible clarity in Mulders's mind. He pulled out a map of Europe from his briefcase, spreading it across a nearby workbench. With a compass and ruler, he began drawing circles combat radius calculations, each circle representing half the total range to account for the return journey. One circle, centered on an airfield in southern England, encompassed all of occupied France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and reached deep into western Germany. Another circle reached Berlin. A third reached Munich and beyond into Austria. "They can fight over our territory," Mulders said quietly, tracing the circles with his finger. "The Americans can engage our interceptors over Germany and still have fuel to return to England. We'll be the ones fighting at the end of long supply lines, landing at damaged airfields, low on ammunition and fuel. They'll have tactical initiative over our own homeland." Brenner stood beside him, studying the map. "There's more." I translated the technical manuals found in the wreckage. This particular Mustang was manufactured in October 1943. The serial number indicates North American Aviation in California had built at least 6,800 of these aircraft by that date, and production is continuing. 6,800. The number landed like a physical blow. This was not a prototype. This was not an experimental aircraft in limited production. The Americans were manufacturing Mustangs by the thousands in factories on the other side of the world, factories that German bombers could never reach, could not even theoretically threaten. Each one of those aircraft represented a 1,650-mile sword aimed at German industry. "How many have been delivered to England?" Mulders asked, though part of him did not want to know the answer. Brenner consulted another document. Intelligence estimates at least 15 fighter groups have converted or are converting to the Mustang as of January. That's approximately 400 operational aircraft, with deliveries continuing weekly. By summer, they could have 800 to 1,000. Mulders did the mathematics automatically, the way he always had. 1,000 Mustangs, each capable of escorting dozens of bombers to any target in Germany. The Luftwaffe had been losing aircraft and experienced pilots since 1941 in the Battle of Britain, then over Russia, then in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Pilot training had been systematically reduced from 18 months to 6 months to 3 months, as the demand for replacements exceeded the capacity to train them properly. Fuel shortages meant new pilots sometimes soloed with fewer than 30 hours of total flight time. Aircraft production was increasingly constrained by raw material shortages, with aluminum being replaced by steel and wood wherever possible. And now the Luftwaffe would face 1,000 Mustangs flown by adequately trained American pilots, operating from secure bases with unlimited fuel and ammunition. He looked back at the P-51, really examined it this time, trying to see it the way an American factory worker might see it. The aircraft was beautiful in its functionality. Every line served a purpose. The nose was long and smooth, housing that powerful Merlin engine. The wings were thin and efficient, generating lift with minimal drag. The cockpit was well designed, with clear visibility and logically arranged controls. Even the landing gear was elegantly engineered, retracting cleanly into the wings. This was what American industrial capacity looked like when applied to military aviation. Not the crude mass production that German propaganda described thousands of inferior aircraft thrown at the problem through sheer numerical advantage. This was precision engineering implemented at mass production scale. Each Mustang was built to high standards, and those standards were being maintained across thousands of aircraft. "We need to test fly it," Mulders said abruptly. "Full combat evaluation against a 109. I want to know exactly how it performs in a tactical engagement." Brenner nodded. "I'll arrange it. Haupt is available to fly the Messerschmitt." Oberleutnant Georg Haupt was one of Rechlin's best test pilots. A former combat pilot with 23 confirmed victories before a crash landing had left him with a permanent limp and reassignment to testing duties. If anyone could identify weaknesses in the Mustang's combat performance, it would be Haupt flying an aircraft he knew intimately. The test flight was scheduled for the following morning, February 20th. Mulders arrived at the airfield before dawn, reviewing the test protocols one final time. The plan was straightforward. Haupt would take off in a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, the standard frontline fighter that constituted the majority of Luftwaffe interceptor strength. He would climb to 20,000 feet and establish a combat air patrol orbit. Mulders would follow in the Mustang, climbing to the same altitude, and then they would conduct a series of mock engagements, turning fights, energy management, vertical maneuvers, high-speed dives. Ground observers with theodolites would track both aircraft and record performance data. Dawn came cold and clear, perfect weather for flight testing. Mulders performed the pre-flight inspection himself, walking around the Mustang, checking control surfaces, examining tires, verifying fluid levels. Everything was in perfect condition. Even after 6 weeks of German examination and several test flights, nothing had malfunctioned or failed. That reliability itself was a data point worth noting in his report. He climbed into the cockpit, settling into the seat that had once held an American pilot. The cockpit layout was logical, almost intuitive. The Americans had clearly consulted actual pilots when designing the instrument panel, placing critical gauges where they could be read easily, positioning controls where they could be reached without stretching or awkward movements. German cockpits were functional but often cramped, with switches and controls positioned wherever space permitted. This felt like it had been designed by people who understood that pilot efficiency directly translated to combat effectiveness. The Packard-built Merlin engine started with a deep, authoritative rumble that spoke of precision machining and careful assembly. Mulders advanced the throttle slowly, feeling the aircraft respond immediately. He had flown dozens of different aircraft types during his career: German, captured French, even a few British aircraft that had been forced down intact. But the Mustang felt different. It felt eager, responsive, like it wanted to fly rather than grudgingly allowing itself to be hauled into the air. He taxied to the runway, received clearance from the tower, and advanced the throttle to takeoff power. The acceleration was impressive. The Mustang surged forward, tail coming up almost immediately, and lifted off the runway with authority. Mulders retracted the landing gear and began a climbing turn toward the designated test area. The rate of climb was extraordinary, over 3,000 feet per minute at this weight. The Mustang went up like it was being pulled by cables, the engine howling, airspeed building rapidly even in the climb. At 10,000 feet, he leveled off briefly to check instruments. Oil pressure steady, coolant temperature in the normal range, manifold pressure optimal, fuel flow exactly as predicted. Everything was perfect, every system functioning exactly as the American engineers had designed it to function. He continued climbing. At 15,000 feet, he was still ascending faster than a standard Bf-109 would manage. At 20,000 feet, he leveled off and began searching for Haupt's Messerschmitt. He spotted it quickly, a small dark shape against winter clouds to the north, orbiting at the same altitude. Versuch 9, I have visual contact. Mulders transmitted over the radio. Confirmed, Haupt's voice came back. Beginning engagement on your call. Engage, Mulders replied. The Messerschmitt immediately rolled hard left and dove toward the Mustang. Haupt was testing the most basic scenario first, a high-side gun pass, the classic advantage position from which countless Allied bombers had been attacked. Mulders reacted instinctively, pushing the throttle forward and pulling back on the stick, converting speed into altitude in a sharp climbing turn. The Mustang responded instantly. Where a heavier aircraft would have wallowed, the P-51 leaped upward, engine roaring, easily evading Haupt's first pass. Good climb rate, Haupt transmitted, professional assessment rather than complaint. They spent the next 40 minutes testing every combat scenario that Luftwaffe pilots might encounter, turning fights at various speeds and altitudes. Energy management trading speed for altitude and vice versa. High-speed dives to test structural limits and control effectiveness. Scissors maneuvers, each aircraft trying to reverse position on the other. Vertical climbs to test power-to-weight ratio. Slow-speed handling to identify stall characteristics. In nearly every test, the Mustang matched or exceeded the Messerschmitt's performance. The only area where the Bf-109 held a slight advantage was instantaneous turn rate at very low speeds. It could pull a slightly tighter radius in the first 2 or 3 seconds of a turning engagement. But that advantage disappeared the moment the fight went vertical or extended beyond a single turn. The Mustang's superior power-to-weight ratio meant it could climb faster, and its superior efficiency meant it could maintain combat power longer. After the 40th minute, with both aircraft's fuel gauges showing the need to land soon, Mulders made one final note. Even after this extended combat test, the Mustang still had more fuel remaining than the Bf-109. In actual combat over Germany, the German fighter would be landing first, low on fuel, while the American Escort could continue flying, could continue fighting, could even strafe airfields and ground targets, before finally turning for England. They landed and debriefed in the operations office. Haupt, never one for diplomatic language, summarized his assessment with characteristic bluntness. If the Americans show up over Germany with 1,000 of these aircraft, we're finished. I could barely keep pace with you, and I knew exactly what maneuvers you were testing. Against a competent American pilot in actual combat, a standard Luftwaffe pilot with average training has maybe a 30% chance of surviving the engagement. Maybe. Mulders spent that evening writing his formal report. He had written hundreds of technical assessments over 5 years, but this one felt fundamentally different. Usually, he was identifying tactical weaknesses that German pilots could exploit, or recommending design modifications that might offset enemy advantages. This time, he was documenting Germany's inevitable defeat in the air war, typed up in precise technical language with supporting calculations and performance charts. Technical assessment: North American P-51 Mustang Performance Summary. Maximum speed 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, superior to Bf-109 G6 by approximately 30 miles per hour at altitude. Service ceiling 42,000 feet, superior to Bf-109 G6 by approximately 3,000 feet. Combat radius 825 miles with external tanks, superior to Bf-109 G6 by approximately 500 miles. Rate of climb 3,475 feet per minute, comparable to Bf-109 G6. Armament 6.50 caliber machine guns with 1,880 rounds total, effective but inferior to 109's cannon armament for bomber interception. Tactical assessment: the P-51 Mustang represents a fundamental shift in strategic capability. Unlike previous American fighters, including the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning, the Mustang possesses both the range to escort bombers to any target in Reich territory and the performance to engage Luftwaffe interceptors on equal or superior terms. The aircraft's fuel efficiency allows extended combat operations over Germany while maintaining sufficient reserves for return to England. Strategic implications: with sufficient numbers, Mustang-equipped fighter groups will eliminate the Luftwaffe's primary tactical advantage, which is the ability to intercept unescorted bombers over German territory. German fighters will be forced to engage enemy escorts before reaching bomber formations, resulting in fighter versus fighter combat, in which the Mustang holds performance advantages. Additionally, German fighters will be operating at the end of their fuel range, while American escorts operate with substantial reserves. Recommendations: first, immediate acceleration of Me-2-62 jet fighter development and production. The jet aircraft represents the only German design with sufficient performance advantage to offset the Mustang's capabilities. Second, tactical shift toward bomber interception methods that minimize exposure to escort fighters, including high-speed slashing attacks from altitude. Third, enhanced pilot training focusing on energy tactics that exploit the 109's slight low-speed turning advantage. Fourth, frank recognition that numerical parity is no longer sufficient. The Luftwaffe will require significant numerical superiority to offset the Mustang's performance advantages. Conclusion: without dramatic technological countermeasures or unsustainable numerical superiority, Luftwaffe fighters cannot prevent American heavy bombers with Mustang escort from striking targets throughout Germany. The strategic air defense of the Reich has become mathematically untenable. Mulders read through his conclusion one final time before signing the document. That last paragraph was dangerous. It was the kind of statement that could result in accusations of defeatism, perhaps even investigation by the Gestapo for undermining military morale. But it was also the truth, supported by flight testing and mathematical analysis. He had a professional responsibility to report what he had learned, regardless of whether the Luftwaffe leadership wanted to hear it. He submitted the report through proper channels, sending copies to the Reich Air Ministry, to the Fighter Command Headquarters, and to several technical officers he knew, personally, who might ensure the information reached decision-makers. Then he waited to see what response would come. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The response arrived faster than expected, but not in the form Mulders had anticipated. 3 days after submitting his assessment, he received orders to report to Berlin for a briefing with senior Luftwaffe staff officers. The message was polite but firm. His presence was required to discuss his evaluation of the enemy fighter aircraft. The tone suggested this was not optional. Mulders took the train to Berlin, watching the German countryside pass by the window. Even here, Hundreds of miles from any active front line, the evidence of the war's grinding pressure was visible everywhere. Factories covered with camouflage netting, anti-aircraft batteries positioned at strategic locations, teenagers in Luftwaffe auxiliary uniforms, boys who should have been in school but were now manning searchlights and ammunition handlers for flak guns. The landscape itself seemed exhausted, worn down by 5 years of total war. The meeting was scheduled at the Reich Air Ministry, a building that had been elegant before the war but now felt shabby and overworked. Mulders arrived early, was directed to a conference room, and found himself facing 5 officers ranging in rank from major to general. He recognized 2 of them from previous technical conferences. The others were staff officers, whose experience was primarily administrative rather than operational. General Major Dietrich Schmidt, head of fighter development programs, opened the discussion without preliminary pleasantries. Hauptmann Mulders, we have read your technical assessment of the captured American fighter. Your analysis of the aircraft's performance characteristics is thorough. Your flight testing appears comprehensive. However, your strategic conclusions are concerning. Mulders kept his expression neutral, his posture correct. Concerning in what way, Herr General Major? You state that the Luftwaffe cannot prevent American bombers with fighter escort from striking German targets. You suggest that our defensive strategy has become, and I quote, mathematically untenable. These conclusions undermine confidence in German air defenses and contradict repeated assurances from the Reichsmarschall that our fighter forces remain adequate to the task. There it was. Not a dispute about technical facts or performance data, but about political implications. Mulders chose his words carefully, aware that this conversation was potentially dangerous. Herr General Major, my conclusion is based on verifiable performance data and range calculations. The P-51 Mustang can escort bombers to Berlin and beyond. In controlled combat trials, it matched or exceeded our frontline fighters in nearly all performance categories. These are measurable facts, not opinions. Oberst Werner Kreiper, a staff officer Mulders did not recognize, interjected. Facts that you are interpreting through a particular strategic lens, Hauptmann. The performance of one captured aircraft does not determine the outcome of an entire air campaign. Pilot quality, tactical doctrine, numerical strength, defensive advantages, all of these factors influence combat results. They do influence results, Mulders agreed, which is precisely why my assessment accounts for them. We are losing experienced pilots faster than we can replace them with adequately trained personnel. Training duration has been reduced to dangerously inadequate levels. Fighter production cannot match American manufacturing output, and now the Americans have deployed an aircraft that eliminates our primary tactical advantage, which is the ability to intercept unescorted bombers. Herr Oberst, I am not making a political statement. I am reporting what the technical analysis indicates. Schmidt leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. And what, specifically, does your analysis indicate, Hauptmann? In concrete terms, Mulders had anticipated this question. He pulled out a chart he had prepared specifically for this meeting, sliding it across the polished table. If American fighter groups maintain their current expansion rate, they will have approximately 1,000 P-51 Mustangs operational over Europe by May or June of this year. Each Mustang can provide escort for roughly 20 heavy bombers on a deep penetration raid. That means the Americans can provide continuous fighter cover for their entire strategic bomber fleet throughout any mission over Germany. He pointed to another section of the chart, where he had graphed Luftwaffe fighter strength against projected American capabilities. The Luftwaffe currently maintains approximately 1,500 single-engine fighters deployed for Reich defense. Those aircraft are distributed across multiple defensive sectors from France to Poland. Against a concentrated raid of 600 heavy bombers with Mustang escort penetrating a single sector, we might be able to commit 300 interceptors. Based on combat trial results, if those interceptors engage the escorts first, we can expect approximately 30% losses before reaching the bomber formations. That leaves roughly 200 aircraft to attack 600 bombers, insufficient to achieve the attrition rates necessary to halt the American bombing campaign. The room was silent. Finally, Schmidt spoke, his voice measured and careful. Your analysis assumes the Americans will execute their strategy perfectly. It assumes we will make no improvements to our own tactics or technology. It assumes that factors beyond pure mathematics, determination, defensive advantages, weather, the inherent difficulties of offensive operations will play no significant role in outcomes. Those factors will certainly play roles, Mulders acknowledged. Weather grounds aircraft on both sides. Determination matters in individual combats. But Herr General Major, I have been evaluating aircraft and calculating performance parameters for 5 years. I know how to identify exploitable weaknesses in enemy designs. The Mustang has very few exploitable weaknesses. Its range makes it strategically decisive. Its performance makes it tactically dangerous. And the Americans are producing them faster than we can destroy them, even if our kill ratios were far better than they actually are. Another officer, a major whose name Mulders had not caught during introductions, spoke up. So, your recommendation is what, exactly? That we inform our pilots the situation is hopeless? That we cease defending German airspace? My recommendations are in the written report, Mulders replied evenly. Accelerate Mi-262 jet fighter production. The jet holds sufficient performance advantages to offset the Mustang's range. Develop tactics that minimize our fighters' exposure to American escorts, high-speed slashing attacks from altitude rather than sustained turning engagements. Focus resources on quality rather than quantity in pilot training. A well-trained pilot in an inferior aircraft is more effective than an inadequately trained pilot in any aircraft. And, he paused, knowing this final point would be the most controversial, prepare for the operational reality that we cannot stop every raid. Concentrate defensive resources on protecting the most critical industrial targets rather than attempting to defend everything equally. Schmidt closed the folder containing Mulders's report with a gesture that seemed final. Thank you for your candor, Hauptmann. Your technical work is valuable. We will take your recommendations under advisement. You are dismissed. Mulders stood, saluted precisely, and left the conference room. In the corridor outside, he paused at a window overlooking Wilhelmstrasse. The street was busy with military traffic staff, cars, supply trucks, motorcycles carrying dispatch riders. Everyone moved with purpose, with the appearance of confidence. The machinery of war continued functioning. None of them knew what he knew, that in hangars across southern England, American ground crews were fueling and arming P-51 Mustangs by the hundreds. That American pilots were training in them, learning their capabilities, preparing for the deep penetration escort missions that would come. That the fundamental mathematics of the air war had shifted in a direction that no amount of German determination or tactical excellence could overcome. He took the evening train back to Rechlin, returning to the familiar routine of testing aircraft and writing technical reports. The Mustang had been repainted in full American markings and relocated to a different hangar, where it would be used for tactical familiarization training, teaching Luftwaffe pilots what to expect when they encountered this aircraft in actual combat. The validation of Mulders's assessment came throughout the spring and summer of 1944, each event confirming his calculations with terrible precision. In late February, the first large-scale Mustang-escorted raids penetrated to targets near Brunswick and Leipzig, exactly as his range calculations had predicted. In early March, American fighters reached Berlin itself for the first time, providing continuous escort for bomber formations, attacking aircraft factories and ball-bearing plants in the capital. The psychological impact on German civilians and military personnel was significant. Enemy fighters over Berlin meant nowhere in Germany was safe. The losses mounted with brutal mathematics. In March, The Luftwaffe lost over 500 experienced fighter pilots defending against American raids. In April, another 400. The replacement pilots arriving from training schools were increasingly young, increasingly inexperienced, increasingly likely to be killed in their first few combat missions. Fuel shortages meant advanced training was curtailed. Aircraft shortages meant new pilots sometimes flew their first combat sortie in aircraft that were worn out, maintained with substitute parts, operating at the edge of mechanical failure. By summer, American Mustangs ranged freely over Germany, escorting bomber formations in the morning and returning in the afternoon to strafe trains, trucks, airfields, anything that moved. Luftwaffe day operations became progressively more dangerous, then prohibitively costly, then practically suicidal. Experienced pilots who had survived years of combat were shot down by American escort fighters they never saw coming. Entire squadrons were destroyed on the ground when Mustangs swept across their airfields at low altitude, destroying aircraft before they could take off. The Me-262 jet fighter that Mulders had recommended as a counter to the Mustang entered service in small numbers in the fall of 1944. The jet was indeed faster and could engage on more favorable terms. But Germany was producing Me-262s in dozens, while the Allies produced conventional fighters in thousands. By the time jet production reached meaningful numbers, there was insufficient fuel to fly them, insufficient trained pilots to operate them, and insufficient time remaining to change the war's outcome. Mulders wrote one final report about the Mustang in January 1945, as Soviet forces approached from the east and Rechlin prepared for evacuation. That report documented additional technical findings and repeated his earlier strategic assessments. By then, the conclusions were academic. American and British aircraft operated over Germany with near-complete air superiority. Luftwaffe fighters that managed to take off were usually destroyed by overwhelming numbers of Allied escorts. The air war that Mulders had predicted would be lost was manifestly, undeniably lost. The Mustang he had test-flown that morning in February 1944, Versuchsflugzeug T9, with its precise panel gaps and powerful Merlin engine and 1,650-mile range, was destroyed during an American bombing raid on Rechlin in April. The hangar took a direct hit. The aircraft that had taught Mulders the mathematics of German defeat was reduced to twisted aluminum and scattered components. After the war ended, Mulders returned to civilian life. He worked as an aerospace engineer for several German aviation companies during the Reconstruction years, contributing to the development of commercial aircraft. He never flew a Mustang again, but he followed its history closely, reading about its service record, its influence on post-war fighter design, its reputation among pilots who had flown it. He was interviewed occasionally by historians researching the air war over Europe. The interviews usually covered the same ground: his assessment of the Mustang, his report to Berlin, the Luftwaffe's response, or lack thereof. In one interview conducted in the 1970s, more than 30 years after that February morning at Rechlin, the historian asked if there was anything Germany could have done differently once the Mustangs arrived in numbers. Mulders thought for a long time before answering. He was an old man by then, retired, his engineering career behind him. He had spent decades thinking about that question, examining it from every angle, testing different scenarios the way he had once tested aircraft performance. Understanding that you will lose a war and having the power to prevent it are two different things, he said finally. I calculated defeat. The mathematics were clear, unambiguous. But calculation is not the same as capability. Germany no longer had the industrial capacity, the strategic resources, or the geopolitical position to counter what the Mustang represented. We could see the future clearly. We simply lacked the means to change it, the historian pressed. But surely if your report had been taken more seriously, if the recommendations had been implemented more aggressively. Mulders shook his head. The Me-262 was already in development when I wrote my report. Pilot training was already being shortened due to fuel and time constraints that my report did not create. The strategic situation was what it was. My assessment did not reveal unknown information, it simply compiled and analyzed facts that were already available to anyone willing to examine them objectively. The problem was not lack of information. The problem was lack of capacity to act on that information effectively. He paused, looking at his hands, an old man's hands, marked by decades of work. The P-51 Mustang I tested represented something profound about industrial warfare in the 20th century. It was not enough to have courage. It was not enough to have tactical skill or even technological innovation. Modern war is decided by industrial capacity, resource extraction, strategic depth, and production efficiency. The Mustang embodied all of those advantages in a single airframe. It could fly 1,650 miles, fight at the end of that flight, and return home. That range was not just a performance characteristic. It was a strategic statement about which side had the resources to fight a long war. The historical irony that Werner Melders carried for the rest of his life was precisely this. He had identified Germany's defeat in the air war in February 1944, calculated it with mathematical precision, documented it in a formal technical report, and submitted it through proper military channels, and nothing had changed as a result. The Luftwaffe continued fighting with inadequate resources against an enemy whose industrial capacity made every tactical victory strategically meaningless. German fighters shot down American bombers and escorts in numbers that would have been devastating to any air force with limited production capacity, but the Americans simply built more aircraft, trained more pilots, and returned the next day. The Mustang that Mulders had flown that clear February morning represented not just an aircraft but a form of warfare that Germany could not match. It was precision engineering implemented at continental scale. It was long-term industrial planning translated into tactical capability. It was the advantage of fighting from a secure industrial base that enemy bombers could not reach, using resources extracted from a territory too vast to blockade, with trained personnel drawn from a population large enough to absorb losses that would have crippled smaller nations. Mulders had calculated all of this in a hangar at Rechlin, standing beside an enemy aircraft that should not have been possible, understanding that 1,650 miles of range meant far more than the distance itself. It meant Germany had run out of geography to hide behind. It meant the airspace over German cities and factories was no longer defensible. It meant that the war, for all practical purposes, was already over. It would simply take another year and hundreds of thousands more deaths before that mathematical reality became a political fact. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.